Oops. Okay. That's what they're seeing?
Yep, you're live. Oh, click there.
Oh, I did.
Okay, click again. Sure. Present to everybody.
And here. Go. Hello, this is Dr. Matt Fleischman, and welcome to the webinar on treating ADD, ADHD successfully with Signet. This webinar is one of a series of 4, and today I'm going to be talking about the whole process of starting out successfully. Let you know that I've been doing this work for a long time, but today is my first day of doing webinars, and so I have the able technical assistance of my co-host Michael, who will look for comments that come up or issues or problems. Also let you know that there's about a 15-second delay between what I say and do on the screen and what you see on your computer. So sometimes if you send a comment, it'll be just a little delayed getting back to us. Okay, so like I said, today's topic is starting out successfully. And I wanted to talk just first off a little bit about where this is coming from. I call this the ADD Successful Project. And my goal is to improve the treatment of attention deficit disorder. And what I mean by that is that as behavioral health specialists, as therapists, we should be looking for better outcomes than we're currently getting, less med use as an outcome, happier families, and also what I call successful practices. I think the thing that makes this certainly possible is neurofeedback. I've been using neurofeedback for over 20 years, been using Signet for 7 or 8. And in the last year or so, I believe that my success rate is at around 90%. And I believe to some degree that's related to how I go about this. And so I wanted to share all this with you today with the hope that if you work with kids or adults with attention deficit disorder, that you might find that you too are getting better outcomes, less meds, happier families, and a successful practice. This is me. Let me explain. I'm a licensed psychologist. I have a PhD with a focus on the treatment of childhood behavior disorders. After graduating from the University of Oregon, I did 5 years of postdoctoral research and then went into private practice for the director of the Center for Attention and Learning in Eugene, Oregon. And I've been in private practice for close to 30 years now. Like I said, close to over 20 of that doing neurofeedback. And in addition, since being out of research in academia, I published one study with Siegfried Othmer, which demonstrated that we had a lasting effect of the improvements from neurofeedback going out 5 years after treatment, as measured by gains in IQ and parental ratings. The organization of this webinar is as follows. Like I said, today is the first of 4, and I'll be talking about starting out successfully, which is largely about how I set up treatment, how I approach the whole process with people. I'll also talk about a practice model, how I set up my office in terms of staff, the intake that I do, the testing that we do, the treatment planning phase, and all of that. And then the upcoming webinars next week, again, they're on Tuesday at 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So they're identical content. the webinar number 2 is about optimizing the neurofeedback. So I'll be talking about neurofeedback, the protocols I use, and how I modify and change protocols. I'm assuming that all the participants are familiar and have some skill with Signet. Have that background. I'm assuming I'm talking to an audience of people who are familiar and use Signet daily. The third webinar is the specific things I add on and do and working with children and teens. And that webinar is in December, the first Tuesday in December. And then the last webinar is a week after that, and that's on working with adults. So that's the content. And let's begin with the whole process of setting up. The issue of setting up, I believe, is because before clients will commit, and any sort of treatment like neurofeedback, you really need them to commit to the treatment. You must satisfy a series of questions that they have, even if they're not explicitly saying them. And the first question is the simplest: what's wrong? What's wrong with my kid, or what's wrong with me? And often what they're asking is it attention deficit disorder? We may want to downplay the use of diagnostic categories in terms of how we think about treating people, but to the clients, whatever's out there in the public and the education, that's what they're interested in. Is it ADD? The next question after you answer that is, can they trust your answers? In other words, how did you go about coming to a clear and firm conclusion that that's what's wrong? And after you've hopefully convinced them or spoken to their issue of, can I trust you? The third one is, what are my treatment options? And then lastly, after that, is, since clearly one of their treatment options is neurofeedback, this whole neurofeedback thing, does it make sense? Because people won't enter into a treatment that they're too skeptical of or highly skeptical of. I say you don't have to believe it. It will work, but they won't enter into it unless they have some confidence that some benefit's going to come to them. And lastly, they want to know, how will they know it's working? I think that's a good question, particularly when you have a technical intervention that involves brain training. They want some idea of, how do you know that this is really not just a grand placebo effect? So these are the questions you have to answer, even though they may not be explicitly stated. So let me talk about the process that we go to, because simply telling people something doesn't convince them. You have to demonstrate it to them. So this is the process when people come through in the whole setting up process. This is before we start any neurofeedback. So you can see here there's a flow chart starting with the intake phone screening and going through various steps, ending up with an evaluation report. And I do emphasize the value of evaluation for lots of reasons. I'll come back to that in a second. But if we're going to go through this process, you need several things. And one of these you need is an efficient way to gather the necessary information, and that's concise, that pulls together, that helps your thinking. Too much various information, too many odds here and there, and I find it hard to keep track of. I have to synthesize for this to work. Having synthesized the information, I then have to do some sort of assessment or testing. It's testing mostly. That is solid, believable. When I show it to other professionals or send it to other physicians, not other physicians, I'm not a physician, to send it to physicians or other therapists or psychologists, they have to look at it and go, okay, this is credible, I'm impressed. Because whatever we're doing, we want to meet the expectations that we are professionals in how we go about it, and that all our work, our assessment, our neurofeedback, our counseling is really, meets that professional standard. I sometimes wince when I see that sometimes neurofeedback is kind of going into a franchisee movement where they hire people and buy equipment. And, I think we run a risk when we lose some of the professional aura or coverage. And the last piece is in this whole model of how you assess and do all this, is you have to be fairly compensated for your effort. I'm asking you, suggesting that you do things, and they're out of the norm of just putting electrodes on people. So everything I'm talking about has to be fairly compensated. Here, one of the good pieces is that if you are insurance eligible for any of your work, and I'm not talking about the neurofeedback part partially, is that you'll find more and more you are compensated for evaluations. People want to know, and even back in the day when I had more insurance companies quizzing me on why you're doing this, the explanation of these are the instruments I use, this is the information it's going to give me, and this will give me commitment to the client participating in the process, usually easily won most people over. So if you look into that, you may find that charging for this gets reimbursed. And even when I have clients who have no insurance, or they have now commonly these very high deductible insurances that they're typically not reaching their deductible, even so, they're willing to say, yes, it's worth paying for to find out something definitive. So the process, now going back to the screen in front of you, is that there is, people call up. I sort of left off here. We get also a lot of referrals. So we get a faxed referral from physicians. That's about 40% of our practice right now. And it's, again, people come in, both children and adults. And one reason I think why I get a lot of referrals for adults is physicians are concerned about adults who show up in their, college students in their 20s and adults in their 30s or 40s and want to be treated for ADD. In other words, they're asking, can they have a prescription for a stimulant medication? And the physicians are saying, well, before I write that, and I don't really know about this, let me send you to somebody who can find out. So I do get a lot of physician referrals. I also get psychiatrist referrals from clients who say to the psychiatrist, what about an alternative to medication? And so get the call, get the referral. I have somebody on my staff, sometimes it's my clinical assistant, but somebody else who will just screen the calls, call the person up, double check why they're calling, make sure that's really who we deal with, the problems we deal with, and then get the insurance information if they have it, to verify that, so that when you get back to people, you can say, this is what it's going to cost, or at least this is what the initial session is going to cost, this is what counseling would cost, this is what testing would cost, if that's what they're looking for. So if the person says, yes, I'm interested, let's at least do an initial session, then the next thing we do is we send a whole package of forms to the client. And I'll be going over those forms in a minute, but we send them all digitally. Almost everybody now has email accounts, and this is a huge time saver. And the people fill out the forms ahead of time. I send forms for the parents. I send to the parents forms for teachers to fill out. If they've done prior evaluations or assessments, ask them to bring those in. But they complete all the forms, and then they come in for the initial session. And it's the initial session where I interview the child and the parents. Typically, I have the child present, pretty upfront about the questions. But what I am doing, and I'm going to come to this in just 1 minute, is I'm going over the intake questionnaire. That's one of the things they filled out. Just real briefly, let me now move on. So this is the form, and hopefully you've downloaded the free downloads. They're all in there. There's a child form. It's a child and teen version, same form for both, and an adult version. And they're 10 pages long. And the thing about these forms is I've refined these forms over the years, that they're a logical flow, so that in the beginning, the questions are obvious. Well, who referred you? Why are you here? Prior testing. And then it goes on to all phases, so that I'm actually getting a very well-rounded view of what's going on. So if you want to take a moment, hopefully you've downloaded this form, you can look through it, but if you haven't, let me just mention, covers up, their health and medications, any behavioral or psychiatric medications that they're, any other health medications they're currently taking, a whole long list for medical concerns. You ever had migraines, chronic pain, allergies, frequent infections, yada, yada, yada. A little bit of developmental history, developmental delays, that sort of stuff. And then I ask about, I have a whole list of adverse childhood events that I've taken off an adverse childhood events checklist. Um, if you're not aware of this concept, adverse childhood events are a huge adverse childhood events are histories of abuse, neglect, family chaos, um, and violence in the family. And when children grow up with these, it has a huge predictiveness in terms of later psychiatric, psychological, behavioral, and health problems. So I don't ask for the nitty-gritty details, just yes or no. And I'll just mention in terms of protocols, if you see a lot of this, then you know you're going to be doing right-sided training. But moving along, I ask about current relationships, sources of support, current strengths, and then I ask to go through a list of common stressors, any of these yes or no, then I go to work history, school history, grades, where they're having problems. It takes most of the parents or adults 45 minutes to an hour to complete, and the thoroughness often varies from anywhere from yep, nope, to people who will actually send appendix and extra lines and further information. But in any case, you're getting people to think about all this stuff. It isn't until page 7 that I actually ask about attention problems. Then I get to questions of oppositionality and anger problems, conduct problems, then depression, then anxiety. There's a question in there about suicidal thoughts or, thinking of hurting yourself. And finally, into alcohol and drugs, caffeine consumption, and a series of questions that kind of taps around autism spectrum. And ending up on easier areas about diet, exercise, and sleep, and some questions about family history. So they complete this ahead of time. And what I do in the first session is after the meet and greet is I tell them that I have to make up a chart. I put a laptop on my lap and I start asking questions that exactly parallel what's on the form. Now I'm holding the form, so I have information there, but it allows people to amplify. It allows me to say at times it looks like this isn't an area of concern. It looks like this is whatever. But by the end of that interview, I've typed in. Now, a lot of typos, sloppy typing, I can clean that up when they leave. But by the end of that session, I have a pretty good, well-rounded history of presenting concerns, background information, and also that the people feel listened to. I've really listened to their concerns. Why do I know their concerns? Because they put them there. Now, I also know about their concerns because we send them various questionnaires, and one of them is called the concerns checklist. It's two-sided, and that also allows me at one glance to make sure you can sort of see where the concerns cluster. Do they cluster just in the attention and learning area, or do they cluster also in sleep? Do they cluster in behavioral areas, emotional regulation, sensory problems, whatever? Gives me a good overview of what I'm looking for. So the intake questionnaire is essential. The concerns questionnaire kind of just in case we miss something. The other questionnaires that are essential to this process and you want to use are the Vanderbilt questionnaires. And I include both the parent and child. The parent form is the one that I also give to teenagers. So even though it says for parents, it's for the home. And the Vanderbilt is a free, widely available questionnaire. It basically tracks the symptoms on the DSM-4, and I think it closely tracks the DSM-5. But this is nice because, again, in this field, we want to track the common diagnostic issues that physicians are going to recognize or psychiatrists. So we want to be within their way of speaking. The scoring of the Vanderbilt is very easy. And let me mention that part of what we have here is I've given you blank Vanderbilt forms. I'm also at the end going to give you the option. I've created Vanderbilt forms that have been particularly recreated so that they work on a computer, so that you can email these to a client and the client can fill them out on the computer. And when they email them back to you, they don't have to print anything. You get them back and they're even scored. So I have the Vanderbilt forms in that format too. But what you got here is the forms themselves. in addition to the Vanderbilt, for children 13 and older, I have them fill this out. And for adults, I have them fill out the DASS, which is the checklist for depression, anxiety, and stress. And the value of the DASS is, okay, depression tracks what we expect for depression. They define anxiety much more closely to represent fear. And if you look at stress, that is feeling overwhelmed. And this is often useful when you're looking at, particularly at adults with ADD, is they may not be depressed and they're not fearful, but they often feel overwhelmed. And they'll say they're anxious, but really what they are is overwhelmed. So more kind of worrisome, worried about things, can't manage things. So I like the DASS, easy to score. The scoring key is on the face of it. And again, we've made a form that you can fill in. I mean, the client can fill in online, open it up, fill it in, hit save, email it back. You've got it, or they can print them out. If they don't print them out, when they mail them back, we actually print them out because we do like to have paper form of some of these. The next one is, well, I should mention there's on the Vanderbilt questionnaire that there's a Vanderbilt version for adults. So it tracks the Vanderbilt, but it's the adult version. And I think it's called the ADD self-help checklist or something. But if you look at it, it's the Vanderbilt for adults. Then I do have another adult questionnaire called the Adult ADHD questionnaire, again, in your downloads package. And this is something I created based on Rady's book, Driven to Distraction. And the reason for this is they make a good point that adults who have ADD or ADHD don't simply present with ADD and ADHD. They present with some other symptoms and patterns. In fact, one of the symptoms I thought was particularly interesting. It's the very first question, and I don't have it in front of me right now, but a sense of underachievement despite whatever level of achievement you've obtained. And that's interesting. In other words, that people with ADD, ADHD often have that feeling, particularly adults, that I could have done better. There's something getting in my way. And I don't know that that's true for people with anxiety or depression. They may say, I've been depressed and it's hampered my life, but in terms of achievement, maybe not the same negative factor. Anyhow, there are 20 questions on there. And what's surprising is that most adults with ADD and their spouses or somebody who knows them well will check off at least 12 of them. And if they have ADHD, they'll check off at least 15 of the 20. So it's a nice questionnaire. Again, gives you a more comprehensive, not just symptom focus, but characteristics of people in this group. And I've already mentioned the concerns checklist. So this is, again, the Vanderbilt questionnaires. I already covered that, so I don't need to go over it. But you can see one of the things I did to the Vanderbilt questionnaires and the copies I sent you is I drew very thin lines between the inattention part, the hyperactivity part, the impulsive part, the oppositional defiant part. And so that when you go through it, it's easy to see which block of symptoms tracks to which symptom category. Okay, so those are the questionnaires. I'll have those. I'll look at them. Excuse me a second. At the intake, I don't go over them with the parent, but if I'm looking at those and I don't see many checks, then I go back. I may want to raise the question, gee, on these forms you sent in, you're not marking too many symptoms. What's going on? But it's generally just hold them till later. And this point, then, we send somebody for testing. And quite often, a lot of times, we'll actually schedule the testing for the few days or the week after the initial intake. In other words, people come in, they're scheduled for that. They're already saying they want to be tested or they think they want to be tested. So we schedule the testing for the following week. And in the testing, we use 4 tests. The first test is the quick test. That's put out by EG Info. I don't know if everybody out in the audience today has it. I highly recommend it. It's a continuous performance test. You hold a small little, it's almost like a game Game Boy type thing. It's got a button on it. It flashes what looks like a tic-tac-toe pattern that either fills out all 9 squares or all the squares except the one in the middle. They flash about every second, and you're instructed to press the button every time you see the pattern where the square in the middle isn't there, and to not press it when all the squares fill up. You give them a practice. It's not hard to do. What makes it a test is it goes on about every second for about 25 minutes. It's a killer. And the fun thing is that when I have kids in the audience during the not the audience, the initial session, before I send them on to the testing, I tell them that one of the things in the testing, I tell them it's 4 hours, and they groan. And then I tell them that one of the tests is kind of like a video game, and they go, yay. And then I tell them, yes, but it's the world's worst video game. And they go, oh, but they actually look forward to coming in to taking the world's worst video game. And then they're always proud to tell me that it was indeed the world's worst video game. But very useful test. And I really have to hand it off to Siegfried and the other team at EEG Info for really improving what was started out as a TOVA into, amazingly good norms and results. So big fan of the quick test. The unit itself, you'd have to go look on the website how much it is. It's $15 for each client that you run it, but you're going to re-administer the quick test, and the re-administrations are free. So it's a cost, but again, you get paid for testing, and I think it's definitely worth using. The second test is something called the NIH Toolbox Cognition Battery. And yes, NIH stands for the National Institutes of Health. And this is something I stumbled on about 2 or 3 years ago. Back then, when they created this, it ran only on Windows 7. I had to hold back an old computer and keep it on Windows 7, and you had to use a certain outmoded version of Internet Explorer, nothing else. So it was a nuisance, and they didn't give you the norms. They published the norms, and you had to create your own conversion keys, which I did. But they've just released it a couple months ago as an iPad version. So you do need to have an iPad. You have to have one of the newer ones. You can't use a mini. You get the iPad from the App Store, but it meets all levels of confidentiality. Plus, and this is the first plus is it's got NIH on it. If you're going to use a test and you're going to send it out to people, that's a brand. But in line with that, I guess they could have done poorly at this job. They did a really good job. The tests in there in the cognition battery you'll recognize them if you don't know any neuropsychological testing or done any. The tests are in there. They administer very easily. They have built-in practices that you have to get correct before you can take the test. I have a problem with a couple of the other, the CNSVS, if anybody's used that, is that the directions are just printed on the screen. You have to do it, and then you go do the test. And of course, ADD people, they don't read the instructions. They assume they'll figure it out as they go along. And so, of course, you get a lot of poor results that you suspect are really invalid because the test, they didn't read the instructions. So the NIH test, you sit in, you give the instructions, the person answers the questions, and then they take the test. Now, they have a lot of tests. You can pick the ones you want, but they have some prearranged batteries. And the batteries if you just ran the test back to back, is about 30 minutes for the battery. But if you, if you're working with a younger kid, you wait between, you don't have to start. You can take a pause between each test. You're probably realistically looking at about 40 minutes to administer that, particularly with ADD kids, because they want to get up and move around, and you need to let them do that to get a valid test. There is a cost on this. Initially, for first 6 months, they charge you $9.99 for unlimited use. And then after that, they said that the cost will come in somewhere between $100 and $200 for a year's unlimited use. Now, they do restrict the use to people. They have some qualification requirement Um, so clearly, I'm assuming that if most people listening to this are master levels in mental health or physical health, that they would you would qualify. So you can submit to them before you actually make any purchases. But I would really encourage the whole network to consider getting this, because one is that the results are exported back to spreadsheets, could be combined, and it does allow us to see what we do, and it really complements the quick test. So NIH Toolbox, to find out about it, it's nihtoolbox.org. Google that, takes you right to it. And they have more. They have videos and manuals and all that stuff. They've really made it much more user-friendly when they moved to the iPad. And the other reason, curious, they explain why they did this. Why is the government funding this? And the reason is that they really feel that across the medical, psychological, psychiatric field, we need to start measuring human performance and neuropsychological performance. And they also have physical performance measures in there, how fast you can walk and balance and things like that. How good is your sense of smell, if you want to give those sort of tests. But they really want people to start collecting this information so that we can track it across research subjects. So that's the NIH Toolbox. Please look into it. I think you'll be pleased. The next one is, and I use 2 paper and pencil batteries next. And why use a paper and pencil? The Quick and the NIH are essentially computer administered. This is a paper and pencil battery, and I think it is really useful to see how people with ADD, and particularly kids with ADD, function when they have to hold a pencil and follow instructions and do things. And the battery that I use is the cognitive assessment system. And somebody in the earlier one said, well, why don't you use the Whisk and Wace, or the Woodcock-Johnson cognitive battery? And I'll tell you why I like this one. I like this one because when you compute the scores and graph them, there is a clear profile for what they say is attention deficit disorder. In other words, if you think of profiles, if somebody is low on every test, on every scale, they're either developmentally delayed or in some way cognitively impaired across the board. If everything is high, they're gifted. But when you have some subscales that are low and others are high, and those two relate to what we believe is attention deficit disorder, then you have a really nice confirmation of what you're looking for. And that's what you get from this test. The 4 subscales, and each subscale has 3 tests. There's 3 tests around planning, which is basically a simple task that wants to see how well you can quickly figure out how to do it well, quickly. There are 3 tasks around what they call simultaneous processing, which is the ability to draw conceptual conclusions around a set of facts. Kind of like the Raven's matrix test is one of them. So that's the simultaneous processing. The third one are 3 tasks around attention, and one of those is the variation on the words in color. So it's words red, green, blue, and yellow, and they have to read them off. But on the last one, the words are in the wrong color, and they have to name the color, not the word. So if you've done neuropsych testing, you may be familiar with some of these. So you have the 3 attentional tasks, and then you have 3 tasks around auditory retention and the ability to make sense of nonsense sentence structure. So they'll have a question like the yellow, pink, the blue. What did the yellow do? It pinked the blue, or they might have another one. It's more complicated, but it's the ability to understand the structure of language. And the interesting thing, and what's predictive, is that kids and adults with ADD do much worse on the planning and attention scale than they do on the other 2. And for many of them, their scores on the other 2, and particularly the visual spatial scales, is very high. So these kids come in, or adults come in, as talented and gifted visually, spatially, but their planning and attention scores are below average. And so they can think real well, but they have a hard time putting into effect all the ideas and plans that they have. Makes a lot of sense when you review it with people. I'll also say that there's a new version. It's the CAS2. The test costs $875 for the test. The materials after that, and that includes materials, the test materials, the materials that you use up, the consumables, are not that expensive. So it's the initial cost of the test. I've had mine for a long time. They hold up really well. It's pretty durable. The other thing is it's culture free. There is nothing in the test that is based on social economic status. So if I know I have people here over in Asia who might be testing, might look at this. I don't know that it's been normed on non-American population, but the tests themselves are certainly culture free. The one drawback to the CAS is the norms only go 5 to 18. However, the tasks were developed on adults. They're culture free. There's no things about bunny rabbits skipping around. So when I administer it to adults, it does not sound silly. We're not talking down to them. And I work on the notion that by 18, your general profile performance should stay pretty stable until you enter into old age. And so for the range of people I'm testing, I think it's relevant, though I do point out the clear caveat that these scores are an estimate, but what I'm looking for is the patterns. So the CAS, the Cognitive Assessment System, you can get from ProEd, ProEdinc.com. It's a major test distributor. If you Google Cognitive Assessment System 2, you'll get it. There are several companies selling it. They have requirements for professional requirements, but I looked at them and the professional requirements seem to be pretty clear that if you have a master's degree in a behavioral health field or a health field, you would qualify. So the next one, and so anyhow, and then the last battery of tests I use is the Woodcock-Johnson Tests of Achievement, and now they're out with number 4. And so why give an achievement test battery to kids when you're testing them, or adults? And the one exception is I don't give it to adults who've, basically finished their education, never going back to school, and have no concerns in that area. But for all children, college students and younger adults who may go back to school for further schooling, giving an achievement test battery is really useful. Now, there are some tests in there I don't give. I don't give the science and social studies, but I give all of the reading, math, and writing tests except for the writing sample. And the battery for the Woodcock-Johnson, which when we give it, it's about 40 to 50 minutes, but it has there's several reasons why this is really essential. One is that you want to know academically where your subject stands. If a child is struggling in the 8th grade and you test them and most of their performance is in the 5th grade, then you know that even if you address the ADD, you may not get a big improvement in school performance unless the school attends or somebody attends to remediation, academic remediation. On the other hand, if a kid's goofing off in the 8th grade and he's performing at the 10th and 11th grade and everything, he could be bored. And take this into account in working with the family and school if you work with the school. The other reason to give these tests is that several of the tests are measures of performance speed. They call it fluency, which is, in their parlance, speed corrected for errors. But when you give these tests, typical for ADD is, let's say, an 8th grader, an ADD kid may be performing at the 9th grade academically, but at the 5th grade or 4th grade in performance speed. And this can account for a lot of the difficulty of just getting the work done with their ADD. So very useful to have this information. People want it. And also when I go over the scores, I always go over it in terms of grade equivalent scores. grade equivalent scores mean something to people. Percentiles, T-scores don't. So definitely worth giving. And so that's the test battery. There are 4 tests. 2 are on the computer, 2 are paper and pencil batteries. Also, all the CAS does integrate with the Woodcock-Johnson, but they have their own formula of what to make of that. We don't use their subset of how they use what they call the PASS system. So anyhow, but the test is still very good, and these are all current versions, recently normed. So after the test battery is done and scored, about a week later, we have the follow-up session. And the follow-up session is where I meet with the parents. If the child is 13 and over, I include the child. If the child is less than 13, typically I don't. May make adjustments. Sometimes you have a very mature kid, you want to bring him in, but a lot of times also you may have a highly reactive kid who won't take to hearing bad news, because sometimes the results have some bad news. We omit them and bring them back at another time. And when I'm dealing with adults, sometimes I ask, do you want to bring your spouse, partner, whatever? Sometimes they do. It's up to them. It's totally their choice. So what happens in the follow-up? And the follow-up is basically a series of steps. And let me go through them, because having done this, I can almost do these in my sleep, other than the results are different from each person. But I have some very definite things I cover and very definite ways of doing them. So this is the sequence I go through. The first thing, obviously, is need to review the results. I actually take all of the forms. I have in my office 2 small love seats at right angles, and then I have my chair kind of in the apex of that, so that I have space in front of me, but right in front of my clients, they're sitting on the love seats. And I put the documents down on the floor. I lay the Vanderbilt, each person's Vanderbilt in front of them, but they can glance, they can see the circled or marked off numbers. They can see the patterns of everybody's. And I explain, gee, you've circled X number of these for inattention. The cutoff is 6. You're saying this person is highly inattentive or is not. This person is hyperactive or this is not. Get down to oppositional. They are or not. Conduct disorder, excess depression, anxiety. They're often curious. Sometimes they've already seen each other's scores. They see each other's if they hadn't before. The interesting thing is, most often there's a high degree of agreement. Not often exact for each item, but the number is pretty close. That surprises me. And even kids, and we have the kids fill out the Vanderbilt during a break in the testing session. And the reason is by then they're more compliant. Where if we sent the Vanderbilts home at the outset before the kid has had a chance to meet us and go to the testing, they're going to blow it off. So they fill that out during the testing. Lay them out in front of people. We flip them over. They see both sides. Vanderbilt, we do the DAS. We do the concerns. They just look at the questionnaires. So then we move to the results. And the first one I go over is the CAS. And again, on the front page of that, there's a big graph that they can see, and it shows this is normal. I don't say normal. I say this is an average score. This is above average. These range scores are below. You can see the pattern. The pattern is suggestive of attention problems. And often, if I point out that which is most common, is the processing scores. In other words, the non-ADD related scores are in the normal range. And then I point out that the planning or attention scores are really weak. They go, oh, that explains it. It's not saying, because it's not saying you're stupid. It says the processing scores are fine, or even in many cases, excellent. But when you bring in the weaker planning and attention scores, it's more of a problem. After the CAS, I go over the quick. For the quick, I go over the 5 omission, commission, response time outliers. That makes sense to people. Those scores clearly make sense. And the table right on the front shows the norms, what they did. And when a person's seen that they missed 94 items and the norm for that age is 12, they go, wow, that is inattention. You're seeing it right here. I don't go through all the other pages, matter of time. It's too detailed for what we need at this point. Then I go over the NIH scores. And again, remember that the CAS doesn't have adult norms, but the NIH does. So the NIH scores are norm for adults. The QUIC is norm for adults. Show them those scores. And again, show them the graph. And then finally, to go over the Woodcock-Johnson achievement scores, again, putting it in grade equivalent, answering their questions. It's surprising whether good or bad. If it's bad, it's confirming what people have experienced. And people say, well, does everybody have ADD? Most of the people, when we do the assessments, do have problems with attention. Sometimes I pick up people who have other issues that are probably causing what they call ADD. But that's often people whose life history is high stress, high achievement, good focus, and then some trauma happened and they're high stress and now their attention's gone down. So that's a historical thing. But 80%, 90% of the people, the testing confirms this. And so it has credibility. This goes back to that earlier issue that there is now credibility in what we're presenting. So after that, I say the conclusion is, okay, that you have attention deficit or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or that you have also oppositional disorder, or you have this issue or anxiety or depression. I say, okay, let me talk about attention deficit disorder because I really want to clarify what a lot of people believe. And my approach here is something I strongly believe, that attention deficit disorder is a difference, not a disorder. And by that, I mean the way that a man who is 6'2" tall, is tall, but does not have a height disorder. And this is the way I work. This is what I propose to my clients. And then I say, but let me explain what that is. And I use the arousal model. The brain speeds up when you run up and down hills and calms down when you sit on the couch. The difference is that for people with attention deficit is that when they're sitting down, when they're doing something that's not meaningful, not exciting, not externally or internally stimulating, the brain settles down into even a lower level of arousal. And in this level of arousal, it's really hard for them to stay focused, retain things in working memory. They just don't function very well. And so, on the other hand, if they're excited by something, they can hyperfocus. And I talk about how you can get so engaged in something that other people are trying to pull you away and say, come on, you got to do this, or we got to go here, and they don't hear it. So I say, it's not a brain that can't focus. It's a brain that can't regulate its focus very well when things are boring. So then I go on and I talk about how ADD can be an asset. And by that I mean is that there are tons of jobs and situations and careers that value people who do really well under urgency, under pressure, or high interactivity, or constant problem solving. And so that can be anything from emergency work, police, fire, but it can also include fields like teaching and sales, anything where there's risk or danger. People, they use that external stimulation, the constant short deadlines to function. Having said how ADD can be an advantage, then we also have to acknowledge that it creates all sorts of problems. And primarily, the problems arise from having to try and maintain focus and avoid impulsive responses because you just can't stand to sit there, wait any longer. And so that's attention deficit. It's a issue of the poor regulation of arousal, which affects your attention. But then I say, the good news is that it's treatable. And then I say, there's 4 treatments, and let me talk about them. So that's the ADD part. I watch people's response, obviously, answer questions as we go, but most people are going, yeah, this makes sense, this makes sense. And then we get into the first thing I talk about is discussing medications. And you might wonder, why am I talking about medications if we're going to talk about neurofeedback? But the reason we're talking about medication is that is still the gold standard. If you don't talk about medications, in my view, you're not talking about what needs to be talked about. And I've even had clients say, we don't want medication. I say, that's fine. I just want to tell you the honest pros and cons. So at least we've covered it, then we can move on. And they're glad about that. So what are the pros and cons of medications to treat ADD? And let's say first off that it works for about 70%. So there's probably 30% of kids and adults who take the stimulant medications and they don't tolerate them well. But of the 70% who do, the major advantage is you very quickly can find out, will these drugs help? In other words, you can take a medication and 20 minutes later have some sense of whether it's going to be helpful. And this is huge to people. Wow, to have something you've struggled with all your life and take a pill and find out that, gee, you're better. This is really pretty cool. So that's medications. That's the pro of medication. The negative, the con about medication is it's not a permanent solution. You have to be on your drugs for it to work. And the research, the studies that are coming out that's saying within 6 months to at most 3 years, most people prescribed medications have stopped taking them. So here you have a chronic condition to which the quote gold standard solution has run its course. And then what are you going to do? That, for my mind, more than all the other stuff, that is the real pragmatic weakness of medication. Now, if they want to do a medication, I do suggest that they work with their doctor to titrate it. And I actually put this in the report. And what I mean by that is you ask simply the doctor to pick whatever medication he or she wants to prescribe, to outline the largest dose that they would allow that person to have. And then for that person to start out on a quarter of that dose for 3 or so days, then bump it up to a half of that dose, then 3/4, and then the full dose. And what you want them to experience is too little medication and too much medication. And I'll tell them too much is not better. It's too much. And when they get that, if they choose to be on medication, then they know what the sweet spot is. It's kind of like Goldilocks and the porridge is just right. So that information is useful because, well, it's useful information. And so that's the medication piece. Then we move on to neurofeedback, and I explain neurofeedback, and I again relate it back to poor regulation of arousal, how the brain drifts higher and lower in its arousal. And I tell them, just like the rumble strips on a highway, they remind you when you've drifted out of your lane. That what neurofeedback, we paste electrodes to your head. It's not shock therapy, but the software can detect shifts in arousal. And when you've drifted out of the desired range, then the movie, if you're watching a movie, shrinks. When you drift back in the range, it gets bigger. If you're playing a video game, the car or whatever slows down, then it speeds up. That's it. I say you could watch that for years and not figure it out because we can't sense our brain. We don't feel our brain. But the brain sees that happening and very quickly, within 30 minutes, starts to alter its own or improve its own regulation so it doesn't drift so easily. And it's a motor skill. It takes time. It's training. It's like learning to play a musical instrument or play a sport, but once retained is maintained. And so that's why training takes time. That's why we're looking at 20 sessions for ADD. We may be definitely looking at up to 40 sessions for ADHD. But I explained that we do it as a group of 20 sessions to see how it goes. And I tell them how we measure progress because that's a question. How do I know I'm getting better? And essential in this is what we call a progress tracker. That's a form. That's going to be a big part of next week's presentation about protocols. But the other one is we tell them at the end of 20 sessions, we can repeat the quick and the NIH tests. I don't repeat the CAS or the Woodcock-Johnson, but I do repeat the others, and then they have an objective measure of how things have gotten better. Okay. After that, I talk about costs and scheduling. I tell them we do it as a group of 20 sessions, and 15 of them are run by my clinical assistant and 5 by me. And I'll talk a little bit about my setup. I work with a clinical assistant. You could run all 20 sessions yourself, but I don't think running sessions is a good use of the trained therapist's time. On the other hand, you have to run some sessions. So I do 5, they do 15. And here it works out that the 5 that I run, because I combine that with counseling, which is another part of the intervention and which we'll cover in sessions, webinars 3 and 4, I interweave it with counseling and also more detailed discussion of how they're progressing. I can legitimately charge that to their insurance as a counseling session, even though we will do some neurofeedback in it. On the other hand, the 15 sessions, right now, most insurance companies are not covering it, and that gets paid up front, and my assistant runs those. I monitor all the sessions, and I'll talk about that again at the next session, but typically we do 2 sessions a week, so it means a client comes in 1 week, sees my assistant twice, comes in the next week, sees me once, and her once. So let me talk about how I've worked. Over time, I've worked with a lot of staff. I know a lot of people have worked alone. I've worked alone at times. I have settled on a model where I have one full-time assistant and myself, and between the two of us, it's a highly efficient system that allows us to treat a lot of clients, earn a sound practice, and yet have really high standards and really good clinical outcomes. So the way I break this out is who does what is really the issue. The clinical assistant, she does the initial screening on the phone. Remember, the people call in, mostly they leave messages. We don't answer the phone when it rings. We call them back. She screens. She verifies insurance. You don't need to use your clinical assistant for this. Basically, anybody can be trained to verify insurance, ask a few questions. The clinical assistant then, she sends all the forms. But again, we have forms ready to go. They're in a zip file. We just send the zip file by email to the client. Very easy, no postage. We used to spend a lot of money on postage, hardly any now. After the client gets the forms, they fill them out. The next thing is she also scheduled the initial session with the client, and I meet the client. So that's the first time I meet them. They've sent in the forms ahead of time or brought them early to the session. That's where I do that clinical session that I talked about before. Then we do the testing. The clinical assistant does that. And the qualifications to be a tester are simply that you follow the manual and be supervised by somebody, and that's me. So there's a repetitiveness about doing the same testing over and over again that it's actually helpful that she does a lot of testing. It's also helpful that she just adheres to the manual. And you get somebody who has good rapport with kids, works out well. After that happens, she scores the test. We both write the follow-up. Her part is to enter scores into it. My part is to enter conclusions and summary and personalize it if anything is just wrong. Meet with the follow-up, that's me. If they want to go into therapy, she does all the scheduling. We schedule all 20 sessions at once, usually through email. Then we do the treatment. Then we do, and I send a treatment summary, and I send an evaluation copy to the doctor and the client. So that's the process. With the two of us, I have only one other staff member, and that's a person who works offsite, simply does my billing and bookkeeping, and so keeps my overhead low. The clinical assistant can treat 2 people at once because all she's doing is running neurofeedback sessions. I've dictated the protocols. We'll talk about how we communicate and keep that going. So that's the process. I strongly recommend it for other people as a way to run a neurofeedback practice. So in conclusion, I want to ask a favor of you. The work I'm doing, I hope to create more material. I hope to get this out and also to pay for the cost of putting this on, assistance, and the material. I've created something that I'm thinking would really be a benefit to you. And what it is I have taken all of the forms and the reports, and I've made them the reports that are the evaluation report as a completely editable template that you can work in either Microsoft Word or Google Docs. You can put your name on it. You can totally customize it to however you want. It'll come out as your free use. It's whatever. And it would probably take you, well, I know it took me hours and hundreds of hours over time developing this. for you. Just, it's much easier if you want to modify it or add your own stuff. You work off of this, but this is really, really an attractive, get you going quickly. I've also taken the intake forms and had them made as to editable PDFs, which means you've seen these. You click on a field, enter into a tab to the next field, enter a tab to the next field. All the forms, all the questionnaires. This really allows you to get to a digital practice and to get out of sending postage, time, and all that. So that whole package of all that stuff, I'm selling for $50, and there will be a link at the end of this if you would like it, and to support my promoting this and getting ADD out there, getting the treatment for ADD out there, to get the network of Signet people really doing great job with this population. So that concludes the webinar. If you have any questions, you can, we don't have any questions. If you have any, you can post them right now. Otherwise, I've really enjoyed presenting this. You'll get a follow-up email, again, pointing out where you can get the forms and everything for purchase. And also, if you missed it, a link to get the downloads that you should have had for this presentation. And just to remind you that the next one is a week from today at the same time, and that will be on the whole neurofeedback protocols and progress tracking. Anyhow, thank you.